They tell us that empires fall because of armies, borders, rebellions. But the truth is quieter, powdered, smoked, swallowed, and far more devastating. Civilizations have not only been conquered by steel, but by desire, engineered in the shadows. Opium was never merely a drug. It was a machine, built, refined, perfected by those who understood one timeless law of power. If you can sedate a people, you can reshape their world without firing a single shot. For centuries, this machine operated beneath the surface of politics and trade, crossing borders more easily than armies and seducing rulers more effortlessly than gold. Its story has been softened, sanitized, hidden behind the polite curtains of medicine and commerce. But every veil lifts eventually, and beneath it lies a truth darker than we were taught to imagine. Because the real cost of opium was not addiction, it was direction. A controlled drift of nations, families, and futures, guided by the hands of those who profited when others slept. And in that drift, humanity learned a brutal lesson. The most dangerous chains are the ones that feel like relief. The earliest origins of opium rise out of the cradle of ancient soil, older than written law, older than the first city walls, older, perhaps, than memory itself. Archaeologists trace its presence to the fertile landscapes of the eastern Mediterranean, where the poppy flower grew wild across windswept fields. To early civilizations, it was not a danger, but a marvel. A plant whose sap could quiet storms within the human body, fear, pain, grief, hunger, and replace them with a softening of the world. In Sumer, clay tablets whisper of it not as a commodity, but as an offering. The poppy was drawn beside symbols of sleep and divine visitation. To partake was to step momentarily beyond the burdens of the waking world and taste the silence of the gods. Temples used it in controlled rituals. Midwives used it in the moments between life and death. When bodies convulsed, when agony broke through, when nothing else could bridge the threshold. The people did not fear it, they revered it. By the time the Egyptians inscribed their medical texts, opium had already settled into the rhythms of daily life. It soothed colicky infants in the night. It eased the final breaths of the dying. It dulled the aches of farmers who bent beneath the desert sun. But beyond this, it became part of the kingdom's spiritual architecture. The priest-physicians knew that suffering was more than a bodily affliction. It was a disruption in cosmic order. To calm the body was to restore harmony, yet something else began to awaken beneath the reverence. An early recognition that this plant could bend the will. Egyptian elites kept stronger preparations for themselves, potions that induced a trance-like serenity. In these states, visions seemed clearer, decisions easier, anxieties distant. They believed it sharpened their communion with the divine. Perhaps at first, it did. Across the Aegean, the Minoans, and later the Mycenaeans, decorated their artifacts with the unmistakable crown of the poppy. One goddess, her arms raised, wore the seed pods like a crown, a symbol both of fertility and of the liminal space between consciousness and dream. For these cultures, opium was not escapism. It was a doorway, a tool for shaping perception, guiding ritual, softening the boundary between humans and their unseen world. But as its use spread, its meaning splintered. To some, it was balm. To others, a sacred messenger. To a growing few, a resource to be controlled. The ancient Greeks refined it further, distilling preparations that blurred the line between healing and transcendence. Physicians like Hippocrates recorded its effects clinically, stripping it of mystique, transforming it into an instrument of medicine. Yet even then, its dual nature persisted. It eased pain, yes, but it also subdued. It quieted. It rendered suffering manageable and obedience easier to maintain. The earliest seeds of its later power, the power to pacify, to influence, were already there, silently taking root. By the time opium reached the empires of Persia, India, and later China, it had shed much of its ritual skin. What entered these lands was no longer just a sacred substance, but a commodity with potential. In the hands of traders, it became portable profit. In the hands of rulers, a strategic resource. And in the hands of ordinary people, a brief, fragile reprieve from hardship. These were the foundations of the opium machine. Not factories, not cartels, not colonial powers, but ancient fields, quiet rituals, and the first intoxicating discovery that a simple flower could shape human destiny far beyond the limits of its roots. As the poppy's slow migration carried it eastward, its role deepened, fractured, and fused with the cultural DNA of every civilization it touched. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Indus Valley and later in Vedic India, where the plant slipped quietly into the pharmacopoeia of early healers. Here, opium lost some of its ritual glow and became something more intimate, woven into the fabric of survival. The region's physicians recorded its effects with meticulous detail. They knew its dangers, yet they also knew that life in ancient India carried pain the way fields carried monsoon water, flooding without warning. Laborers tore muscles in brutal heat. Warriors staggered from battlefield wounds. Mothers suffered infections after childbirth. Even kings, decorated in gold and guarded by status, could not escape sickness. And so, opium emerged as a universal companion in suffering. A sedative, an anesthetic, a remedy for sleeplessness and torment. Unlike in the Mediterranean, where opium carried divine associations, in India its power lay in its pragmatism. It was not worshipped, it was used. And in this shift, from sacred object to tool of necessity, the world's future relationship with opium took shape. Reverence could limit a substance, necessity could multiply it. Caravans carried these preparations north, threading through mountain passes into Persia. There, opium encountered a culture renowned for its medical scholarship. Persian physicians refined extraction techniques and recorded subtleties of dosage that would influence centuries of medical thought. Under the Achaemenid kings, opium became a curated resource, not a luxury, not a miracle, a strategic asset of the empire. Here, however, another truth surfaced. The people who cultivated the plant were not the ones who consumed its finest distillations. The rural farmers who scored the pods under the sun rarely tasted the elixirs reserved for nobles and scribes. Already a pattern emerged, a hierarchy of access. A shadow of the global inequities opium would one day deepen. But it was not until the plant reached China that its destiny took a decisive turn. China did not simply adopt opium, it transformed it through centuries of medical philosophy. Early Chinese physicians saw it as powerful but unstable, classified among substances that could heal when used with precision or destroy when misused. They approached opium the way one might approach a dangerous animal, with respect, caution, and a recognition that power does not forgive ignorance. In its earliest centuries there, opium was almost exclusively medicinal. Decoctions for dysentery, balms for chronic pain, a sleep aid for the elderly. It did not yet carry the intoxicating aura that would later reshape the empire. Instead, it was a controlled ingredient, dispensed by experienced practitioners who understood the body as a delicate system of balances. But opium carried another trait that defied borders and philosophies. It soothed the hardest edges of human existence. No society, no matter how refined, could entirely confine such a force. And so, slowly, quietly, recreational use spread. At first among scholars seeking calm for their studies, then among elites seeking a gentle escape from the pressures of court life. Finally among laborers who discovered that a small dose could dull the relentless grind of poverty. With each passing generation, the plant shed another layer of restraint. And yet, across every ancient world, a paradox endured. Opium could elevate the human spirit or erode it. It could open a path toward healing or carve tunnels of dependence beneath daily life. Its power was not just chemical, but symbolic, reflecting the universal tension between suffering and relief, discipline and surrender, clarity and oblivion. The ancient world understood this duality instinctively. They did not demonize opium. They feared the imbalance it could introduce. Priests controlled its ritual use. Physicians controlled its medicinal application. Rulers controlled its trade. Ordinary people, however, lived in the uncertain margin, where access existed. But boundaries were hazy. Still, no civilization saw the plant as an existential threat, not yet. To them, opium was like fire, dangerous but essential, illuminating yet consuming, governed not by evil but by excess. The seeds of catastrophe had not yet sprouted. The machinery of exploitation had not yet formed. But the blueprint was already there, contained not in the plant itself, but in the human response to it: adoration, dependency, profit, control. And every ancient hand that touched the poppy, farmer, healer, priest, merchant, added another piece to the architecture of what opium would eventually become. A global engine of leverage, a tool for soothing pain in the morning and shaping nations by night. Where ancient civilizations saw a remedy, later powers would see opportunity. Where healers saw balance, strategists would see dominance. And where the earliest farmers saw nothing but a flower, entire empires would one day see a weapon. The ancient world prepared the soil. The next era would plant ambition in it. As the ancient world dissolved into the turbulent exchanges of early global trade, the poppy and its potent resin slipped from the realm of localized healing into the bloodstream of entire continents. What had once been a sacred tool or medicinal necessity now became a commodity with a gravitational pull strong enough to redirect caravans, shape diplomatic relations, and alter the rhythms of daily life across disparate cultures. The Silk Road, sprawling, perilous, and endlessly hungry for goods, played the most decisive role. Through its winding arteries, opium traveled in small, well-guarded packages, each more valuable than silver. Traders did not speak of the plant with spiritual reverence anymore. They spoke of margins, volumes, and the uncanny ability of this resin to command desire in every market it reached. In Central Asia, nomadic tribes received opium as both medicine and social lubricant. It soothed injuries from harsh travel, eased restless nights beneath storm-torn skies, and became part of exchange rituals that solidified alliances. To them, it was a gift of endurance, a way to pacify pain without halting movement. Yet even here, signs emerged of a quieter transformation. Elders began to caution that too much of the substance dulled the instincts required for survival. A warrior who relied on opium risked losing not only his sharpness, but his place within the tribe's demanding ecological balance. Meanwhile, Persia, already a center of medical advancement, positioned itself as a refining hub. Scholars experimented with new preparation methods, turning the raw resin into more potent mixtures. Cities like Nishapur and Herat became known for apothecaries whose shelves glimmered with glass jars containing deep brown opium tinctures. What formed here was an early prototype of a pharmaceutical economy: knowledge, extraction, refinement, distribution. But the most pivotal transformation has occurred farther east, in the sprawling networks of Southeast Asia and eventually the South China Sea. Maritime trade routes expanded the reach of opium beyond the Silk Road, transforming it from a continental good into a global one. Arab merchants, Chinese sailors, Indian financiers, each recognized opium's unique stability. Unlike fragile spices or perishable goods, opium endured humidity, temperature shifts, and long voyages without losing its potency. It was a trader's dream. Compact, durable, profitable, desired. In port cities such as Calicut, Malacca, and Canton, opium became an invisible currency that flowed beneath the official records. It was rarely listed openly. Instead, it passed discreetly through the hands of brokers who understood its dual identity: legal medicine on paper, intoxicating luxury in practice. As wealthier classes in these cities indulged recreationally, the drug acquired new meanings: a mark of sophistication, a conduit for introspective evenings, a symbol of detachment from the chaos of urban life. China, already familiar with medicinal opium, now encountered the substance through foreign trade in a more concentrated form. This was the beginning of a shift neither physicians nor rulers could fully anticipate. What entered the empire was stronger, more refined, and more tempting than the modest preparations used in traditional medicine. And alongside the substance came foreign traders who understood how to cultivate appetite as strategically as they cultivated relationships. The philosophical interpretation of opium also evolved across cultures. In the Islamic world, where intoxicants were religiously restricted, opium occupied a gray zone. Some scholars argued that its medicinal use was permissible. Others insisted that excessive enjoyment crossed the line into moral corruption. This tension created an atmosphere of both concealed indulgence and public condemnation, a contradiction that would echo through the centuries. In India, opium's symbolism reversed. No longer the pragmatic tool of earlier Ayurveda, it became tied to hospitality in certain courts. Nobles welcomed guests with small doses rolled in betel leaf, framing the drug as a gesture of generosity. To refuse it could be interpreted as distrust. Here, opium did not erode social bonds. It enforced them. In China, its meaning became more enigmatic. Scholars praised its ability to clear the mind and inspire reflection. Poets wrote verses that drifted between lucidity and dreamlike surrender. Among the literati, opium smoking acquired a veneer of intellectualism, a way to loosen the rigid constraints of scholarly life, to navigate sorrow or ambition through softened consciousness. Yet beneath that veneer, addiction quietly advanced. Everywhere opium traveled, it adapted to the needs, anxieties, and aspirations of its new cultural hosts. It was protean, shifting shape effortlessly, becoming what each society lacked most: medicine, relief, reward, ritual, escape. But as its presence grew, so too did its shadows. Where some saw enlightenment, others saw dependence. Where some saw trade, others saw exploitation. Where some saw pleasure, others foresaw collapse. The world had not yet recognized opium as a weapon. But the mechanism, the opium machine, was assembling itself piece by piece. Trade networks, cultural desires, economic incentives, philosophical justifications. And in the coming centuries, those pieces would lock together with devastating precision. As global networks thickened, opium became more than a traded substance. It became a mirror reflecting the deepest fractures and ambitions of every society it touched. By the late medieval and early modern periods, its diffusion had accelerated beyond the intentions of healers and merchants. The substance no longer traveled solely in caravans or jars. It traveled in stories, reputations, and whispers of a pleasure so refined it felt almost spiritual. Nowhere did this transformation unfold more dramatically than across East and Southeast Asia. Maritime merchants mastered routes that cut across monsoon-warmed waters, connecting Indian opium fields to the hungry markets of coastal China. the vibrant kingdoms of Siam, and the thriving islands of the Malay archipelago. With each port visited, the substance accumulated new layers of meaning. In Siam, rulers taxed opium heavily, turning it into a controlled stream of royal revenue. The palace acknowledged its dangers, but it also recognized its economic inevitability. Farmers relied on it after brutal seasons. Soldiers used it to quell terror before battle. City dwellers chased its tranquility after days filled with political volatility. The kingdom did not endorse opium. It tolerated it, contained it, and quietly benefited from its demand. In the Malay world, especially in bustling entrepôts such as Aceh and Malacca, opium became entwined with the rhythms of multicultural trade. Chinese migrants, Arab sailors, Indian financiers, local rulers, all partook, all traded. It became a substance of neutrality, something that transcended language and ethnic divides. Yet, this very neutrality made it a subtle unifier of vice. In smoke-filled chambers, men of distant origins negotiated deals, forged alliances, and at times surrendered judgment to the same gentle haze. But as opium spread outward, it also spread upward. Its influence seeped into aristocracies, courts, and the cultural elites whose choices sculpted narratives for generations. The rise of the literary opium culture. By the early modern era, particularly in China, opium began to permeate the intellectual sphere. It was no longer just a means of softening physical pain. It softened existential burdens. Scholars, burdened by imperial examinations, bureaucratic hierarchies, and the crushing expectations of lineage, welcomed the calm that opium smoking provided. Among poets and painters, it became a companion of introspection. They believed it sharpened sensitivity, that it peeled back the noise of the world, that it allowed them to approach truth from a softened angle. Some works from this period, subtle, melancholic, drenched in introspective longing, carry unmistakable traces of opium's quiet influence. The drug did not create genius, but it created a state in which genius could drift unanchored, unbothered, unburdened. This intellectualization of opium was pivotal. It reframed the drug not as medicine or commodity, but as being a cultural artifact, something that signaled refinement, contemplative depth, and emotional sophistication. The elites who embraced it shaped trends that trickled downward, slowly normalizing the practice across social layers. When opium became a symbol, across Eurasia, opium gained symbols that surpassed its physical form. In Persia, opium became associated with poetic sorrow, the kind of sadness embraced rather than escaped, where the smoker allowed melancholy to settle before drifting into hazy solace. This aestheticization turned opium use into a philosophical statement. In India, the Rajput warrior caste ritualized opium drinking as part of diplomatic greetings and peace negotiations. A shared cup signified trust, mutual vulnerability, and the softening of hostility. In this context, opium became political, an instrument of alliance, a performance of goodwill. In the Ottoman Empire, the drug's symbolic role diverged sharply. For the court and urban elites, opium served as both medicine and indulgence. But for reform-minded scholars, it came to symbolize stagnation, a soft rot creeping through society, a substance that lulled the empire into complacency. This perception, part fear, part metaphor, would echo across later eras, becoming one of opium's most enduring cultural interpretations, the sweet poison that erodes nations from within. The turning point. Commercialization without restraint. The final stage of cultural expansion arrived not through desire, but through opportunity. As global commerce intensified during the 15th or 17th centuries, the motivations surrounding opium shifted decisively. No longer was it merely a culturally flexible substance. It became a commodity in the emerging capitalist imagination. European traders recognized what earlier merchants had not dared to fully exploit. Opium's demand was bottomless, its addictive potential nearly unbounded, and its compact value ideal for long-distance transport. At first, European involvement remained peripheral. But they observed the trade carefully, noting consumption patterns, market vulnerabilities, and the social classes most susceptible to regular use. They recorded these details with the precision of surveyors, mapping desire the way one maps rivers or coastlines. And in this observation lay the seed of a coming catastrophe. Because while Eastern cultures integrated opium into existing rituals and philosophies, developing flexible yet imperfect systems of control, Western mercantile powers saw something else, a market waiting to be engineered. Where others saw medicine, they saw machinery. Where others saw risk, they saw leverage. Where others feared dependence, they recognized an empire-building tool. This ideological divergence between cultural integration and economic exploitation marked the turning point in opium's global history. It transformed the substance from a wandering companion of ancient civilizations into a calculated instrument of emerging colonial power. And the world was about to learn what happens when desire becomes a weapon. The moment opium shifted from cultural artifact to economic instrument, the world crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. The substance that once eased ancient pains now entered the age of organized exploitation, an era defined not by ritual or healing, but by conflict. Layer upon layer, the opium machine tightened its gears, drawing nations, races, sciences, and economies into a system of dependency engineered for profit and dominance. This conflict did not erupt all at once. It unfurled like a long shadow, first subtle, then unmistakable. And at its heart lay one truth. Opium had become too profitable for the powerful to let go, and too destructive for the vulnerable to withstand. Economic conflict, the empire of profit. By the time European mercantile powers entered the Eastern trade networks with full force, the opium market had already reached a fragile equilibrium. Asian empires regulated it unevenly, but understood its potency. They taxed it, constrained it, tolerated it where necessary. Europe did not want equilibrium. Europe wanted leverage. The British East India Company, in particular, saw opium as a perfect solution to its deepening trade deficits with China. Silk, porcelain, and tea flowed westward in staggering quantities. European silver drained in return. The balance was catastrophic for Western coffers. So the company imposed a brutal economic strategy in India. Force cultivation, control production, weaponize addiction. In Bengal, farmers were coerced into poppy cultivation through impossible loans and unpayable debts. Entire villages reoriented their lives away from food crops. The British did not simply expand opium production, they restructured entire regional economies around it. What emerged was a rigid system powered by desperation. Farmers trapped in cycles of obligation, overseers maintaining quotas, and imperial accountants calculating profits with clinical precision. This was no longer trade, it was extraction. And when those shipments reached China, despite imperial bans, the demand grew too quickly, too deeply, for the Qing administration to contain. In coastal markets like Canton, opium was not simply sold. It circulated through clandestine networks that fed the growing appetites of soldiers, laborers, officials, and elites alike. The economic conflict was not just between nations. It carved fissures within societies themselves. Producers versus enforcers, smugglers versus rulers, addicts versus families, officials versus their own temptations. Opium had become a currency of vulnerability, racial, ethnic conflict, the politics of other people's weakness. As addiction spread through China, Southeast Asia, and parts of India, Western powers developed an insidious narrative to justify their involvement. They racialized the consequences of their own policy, framing Asian susceptibility to opium as evidence of cultural inferiority rather than victims of a manufactured crisis. British officials wrote reports portraying Chinese people as naturally prone to vice, ignoring that it was British ships flooding their markets. Missionaries lamented the moral weakness of Asian societies, while their own governments profited from supplying the substance that fueled that weakness. This racialized framing served two purposes. It justified imperial intrusion. If these societies cannot control themselves, the argument went, we must intervene for their own good. It obscured Western responsibility. By blaming Asian character instead of colonial policy, empires could present themselves as reluctant participants rather than architects of devastation. Inside Asia itself, ethnic tensions deepened. Chinese laborers in Southeast Asia were often associated with opium dens, leading local populations to stereotype them as corrupting influences, even though the trade itself was operated and taxed by colonial authorities. In India, communities forced into poppy cultivation resented groups exempt from the system, creating internal fractures ripe for colonial manipulation. Opium did not merely intoxicate. It reshaped ethnic hierarchies, reinforcing narratives in which one group's suffering became another's justification for dominance. As scientific was medical conflict, when healing became harm. In Western laboratories, the study of opium split along two incompatible paths. On one side stood the idealists, scientists who sought purification, clarity, understanding. They isolated morphine in the early 19th century, believing they had finally extracted the safe essence of the poppy. What they created, unknowingly, was a more potent pathway to dependence. A substance that entered the bloodstream with unprecedented purity and force. On the other side stood the pragmatists, physicians who saw opium as indispensable. Before anesthesia, before antibiotics, before modern pain management, opium was the closest thing to a miracle medicine. It calmed convulsions, numbed agony, and allowed surgeries that would otherwise be unthinkable. This duality created a scientific dilemma. Could a substance be both indispensable and catastrophic? The medical community fractured. Some insisted opium was too useful to restrict. Others warned that overprescription was manufacturing dependence in soldiers, factory workers, and even respected families. But the factories in Europe's industrial centers kept producing morphine. The armed forces kept stocking it for battlefield wounds. Pharmaceutical companies kept marketing opium tinctures for everything from anxiety to menstrual pain. Science tried to heal the world. Then profit stepped in and redirected its hand. The lines between medicine and manipulation blurred, and the machine kept growing. The conflict had only begun. Political games, propaganda engines, criminal networks, and global power structures were waiting in the shadows, ready to seize the machinery of opium for themselves. Political manipulation, when governments learned to pull the hidden strings. As the opium economy expanded, governments, both colonial and local, recognized its unparalleled political usefulness. It was not merely a commodity. It was a lever, a silent instrument capable of weakening enemies, financing armies, and justifying interventions under the guise of moral responsibility. Nowhere was this more evident than in China. The Qing dynasty fought desperately to contain the spiraling addiction threatening its social fabric. Edicts banned the substance repeatedly. Officials were executed for corruption. Maritime patrols were strengthened, yet each attempt triggered a counterforce. Western powers mobilizing diplomatic pressure to keep the trade alive. The situation reached a tragic absurdity. A sovereign nation pleading for the right to protect its own population, while foreign empires demanded unrestricted access to sell the very substance destroying it. The Opium Wars were not simply military confrontations. They were political performances engineered by Britain to portray China as obstinate, irrational, and in need of opening. The narrative masked the real motive, ensuring an unbroken flow of profit. Within China, the political conflict deepened. Some officials secretly consumed opium, even as they signed anti-opium edicts. Others accepted bribes from smugglers. Provinces complained about imperial hypocrisy. The dynasty's struggle became twofold: against foreign powers abroad and against its own eroding moral structure at home. Elsewhere, opium became a political currency. In British-controlled India, taxing poppy cultivation filled colonial treasuries. In Southeast Asia, colonial regimes regulated opium sales to fund administrative expansion. In Europe, politicians avoided restricting pharmaceutical opiates to maintain favor with powerful industrialists. Opium had entered politics not as a topic of debate, but as the engine beneath the table. Quiet, invisible, indispensable. And once politics tasted such effortless revenue, it refused to let go. A media propaganda. Stories that shaped a century. The rise of global print media transformed opium from a shadowy trade into a story. One that could be shaped, weaponized, and sold to the public in carefully constructed narratives. Western newspapers portrayed China as helplessly addicted, glossing over the fact that Western ships supplied the very substance they condemned. Editorials argued that British intervention was civilizing, framing the erosion of Chinese autonomy as benevolent enlightenment. Propaganda did not spread lies. It spread distortions. And distortions are far more dangerous than lies. In contrast, within China, anti-opium literature exploded. Poems, pamphlets, and moral essays described opium dens as tombs of the living, where men wasted away beside oil lamps and dim braziers. The imagery was not exaggerated. Dens existed. But the rhetoric fueled a moral panic that painted users not as victims of global exploitation, but as moral failures. These opposing narratives, Western self-justification and Eastern self-blame, created a devastating psychological conflict. They obscured the true architecture of power and framed the crisis as a consequence of individual weakness rather than imperial design. Meanwhile, in Europe and the United States, pharmaceutical companies advertised opium-based remedies with soothing imagery. Mothers calming infants, doctors reassuring patients, workers revitalized by soothing syrups. Media became the velvet glove covering the industry's steel machinery. Between East and West, between colony and empire, between addict and administrator, opium was never just a substance. It was a story. And those who controlled the story controlled the world's perception of the truth. Criminal underground, the underbelly of a global empire. Where money concentrates, shadows follow. Even as governments regulated opium through official channels, an enormous criminal infrastructure flourished beneath the surface. In coastal cities like Canton, Hong Kong, and Singapore, syndicates managed smuggling operations with ruthless efficiency. Smugglers bribed customs officials, cooperated with corrupt naval officers, and built clandestine supply chains that could shift routes in days. The criminal world saw what empires saw. People would always crave relief, and relief could always be monetized. In China, secret societies known as triads expanded their power through control of opium dens, collecting protection fees and establishing parallel legal systems. In India, local criminal groups stole or diverted opium from colonial warehouses, selling it back into underground markets. Across Southeast Asia, Chinese and Malay syndicates collaborated to dominate distribution networks. Unlike governments, criminal organizations made no excuses for their involvement. They understood opium for what it was: a commodity that enslaved without question and paid without pause. The line between crime and commerce blurred. When colonial authorities relied on opium revenue to finance administrative budgets, who was truly criminal? When officials accepted bribes from smugglers, who held the moral upper hand? The underground did not simply distribute opium. It exposed the hypocrisy of regimes claiming moral superiority while feeding the machine from the shadows. Global geopolitical consequences, a world rewired. By the late 19th century, opium was not merely an economic or social issue. It had reshaped the geopolitical map. The Opium Wars cracked China's sovereignty open, allowing Western powers to carve ports, seize concessions, and dictate trade policy. This fragmentation weakened the Qing dynasty's legitimacy and accelerated internal rebellions. In India, forced poppy cultivation made millions economically dependent on a crop they could not eat, deepening famine vulnerability and amplifying resentment that would later fuel anti-colonial movements. Southeast Asia witnessed similar patterns: revenue farms, colonial monopolies, and a new class of intermediaries whose fortunes depended on the addictive cycle of supply and demand. Globally, the opium machine reshaped alliances. Britain allied with commercial interests in India. China partnered with missionaries and reformers seeking reform. Southeast Asian rulers negotiated with both smugglers and colonial officers. The drug had become a geopolitical language, spoken in treaties, enforced by gunboats, financed by addiction, maintained by desperation. This was no longer about opium. It was about power. Economic, political, cultural, global. Channeled through a substance capable of bending entire civilizations. And in the wake of this transformation, the world stood on the edge of a crisis that would reverberate well into the modern era. The global conflicts engineered by opium did not resolve with treaties or shifting borders. Instead, they simmered, hardened, and re-emerged in new forms, spreading from imperial courts to the very foundations of modern statehood. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the opium machine evolved from a colonial mechanism into a worldwide system of control that no nation could fully escape. Every conflict, economic, racial, scientific, political, media-driven, criminal, geopolitical, fed into a single, unstoppable current, a world reordered around dependency. Yet beneath these vast structures lay millions of individual stories, families, villages, entire communities, caught at the intersection of forces far larger than themselves. To understand the full weight of the conflict, we descend now from global scale to human ground level. The local implosions, communities under strain. In the provinces of southern China, the aftershocks of the Opium Wars rippled through daily life. Once vibrant towns turned somber as sons, fathers, and laborers drifted into dens lit by dim oil lamps. Inside, time seemed suspended, smoke curling in pale ribbons, wooden beds creaking beneath languid bodies, voices fading into murmurs. Outside, fields went untilled, workshops emptied, family savings dissolved into ash. But addiction was only the surface symptom. Beneath it lay a deeper wound, a pervasive sense of humiliation. People knew the origins of the opium devastating their homes. They knew it arrived in foreign ships escorted by foreign guns. And they knew their government, battered, fragmented, stripped of dignity, could not protect them. This collective wound did more than destroy livelihoods. It eroded trust in the social order. Rebellion swelled, secret societies proliferated, and the dynasty's authority thinned until it resembled the smoke its citizens inhaled. In India, the consequences took another form. The forced poppy cultivation system spread famine-like conditions, not because food was absent, but because food was no longer grown. Farmers trapped in colonial loan cycles watched their children starve beside profitable fields. Villages once self-sufficient became economically strangled. Even those who resisted were punished with confiscation, imprisonment, or the quiet violence of debt. Here, the conflict was not addiction, but enforced vulnerability, a slow suffocation that turned entire regions into cogs of an empire's revenue machine. The cultural erosion. Identities unraveled. In Southeast Asia, where Chinese migrant communities grew rapidly under colonial economies, opium became both a scapegoat and a survival tool. Governments monopolized its sale, claiming moral stewardship while extracting enormous profits from the very people they criticized. This contradiction produced a social stigma that survives even now. Opium was framed as a Chinese vice, reinforcing ethnic boundaries that shaped urban demographics, labor hierarchies, and even early immigration policies. Newspapers in colonial Singapore, Batavia, and Rangoon reproduced caricatures of Chinese smokers, thin, hollow-eyed, slumped-over pipes, as if addiction were an intrinsic trait rather than the product of a system engineered by the state itself. Such portrayals were not accidental. They served to divide populations and legitimize colonial dominion. If one community appeared weak or morally compromised, another could claim the right to rule. And in that divide, cultures splintered. Generation after generation inherited not only trauma, but narratives crafted to justify the structures that caused it. The ethical collapse, when morality became optional. Across the world, institutions tasked with upholding order became entangled in the opium machine. Colonial administrators knowingly financed their governments through addiction. Western pharmaceutical companies marketed opiate tinctures to millions without warnings. Chinese officials profited privately from smuggling even while preaching reform. Local rulers taxed dens they publicly condemned. Moral contradiction became the governing logic of the era. It was not that leaders were unaware of opium's consequences. It was that opium offered too much. Too much revenue, too much leverage, too much quiet control. The result was a profound ethical vacuum. Addiction was condemned, but supplied by the condemners. Suffering was lamented, but used to justify further domination. Policies claimed to protect the vulnerable, yet targeted them for revenue. In this vacuum, the opium machine tightened its grip. No longer dependent on a single power or region, it had become global. A transnational creature feeding on contradictions. The final lock, a system too large to dismantle. By the early 20th century, nations began discussing international narcotics control. Treaties were drafted, commissions convened, moral campaigns launched. At first glance, this seemed like progress, yet the machine resisted, because by then, economies depended on opium taxation, pharmacies depended on opiate sales, criminal syndicates depended on smuggling, empires depended on the geopolitical leverage it created. Millions of addicted individuals depended on daily doses to function, and governments depended on the social quietude that opium induced among restless populations. No treaty could dismantle such entanglement overnight. No moral awakening could undo a century of engineered demand. So the world entered a new phase, not of prevention, but of restructuring. The opium machine would not be destroyed. It would be modernized, rebranded, redistributed through new channels that would soon define the 20th century. Behind the collapse of empires and the rise of nations to be, another transformation prepared itself. The shift from colonial opium to modern narcotics industries, from smuggling routes to pharmaceutical pipelines, from opium dens to clinical prescriptions. The conflict was not ending. It was mutating. And the next era would prove that a substance once used to soften pain could metastasize into the architecture of modern dependency. The 20th century inherited the ruins of the opium age. But instead of dismantling the machine, it rebuilt it in new forms, wrapped in modern language, scientific authority, and corporate polish. The conflicts of empires gave way to the conflicts of nations, institutions, and global markets. Opium as a plant began to fade into the background. Its derivatives, morphine, heroin, synthetic opioids, took center stage, and the line between medicine and manipulation blurred more than ever before. The modern world did not escape the legacy of opium. It refined it, the lingering injustice, wounds that never healed. In China, memories of the opium wars hardened into national trauma. Even after addiction rates declined in the mid-20th century, the emotional scar remained. A collective memory of humiliation, a reminder that sovereignty could be stolen not only by gunboats, but by dependency. Chinese political identity, especially in the decades following revolution, was built partly upon the vow: never again. Never again would foreign powers dictate the nation's destiny through a substance designed to weaken its people. This vow shaped policy for generations. Strict narcotics laws, harsh penalties, anti-opium propaganda built into national education. Even today, echoes of that past inform public attitudes. Meanwhile, in India, the memory of forced poppy cultivation remained an open wound. Families in regions like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh passed down stories of ancestors who starved while growing profitable crops for the colonial state. The resentment did not vanish with independence. It became part of a larger narrative about exploitative economic systems and the long shadow of European empire. In Southeast Asia, the lingering injustice took a different form. Entire communities were left with social stigmas branded onto them by colonial propaganda. Chinese diaspora populations carried the burden of being unfairly associated with opium use, even long after the trade had shifted. Colonial stereotypes hardened into modern prejudices, shaping immigration policies, urban zoning, and community relationships. These injustices were not isolated memories. They were living structures, still influencing societies long after the dens closed and the gunboats withdrew. Modern contradictions. When morality met profit again. The early 20th century saw a global push to regulate narcotics. The Hague Convention of 1912, followed by later agreements, marked the world's first collective attempt to control the opium trade. Nations pledged to limit opiate production to medical use and to crack down on smuggling networks. But beneath the surface, contradictions proliferated. While governments denounced heroin trafficking, pharmaceutical companies synthesized new opioids, codeine, oxycodone, hydromorphone, claiming they were safer, cleaner, more controlled. Hospitals used morphine widely for pain management. Doctors prescribed opiate cough syrups and nerve tonics to millions. Advertisements portrayed these substances as symbols of modern medicine, freed from the moral baggage of old-world opium dens. In other words, the drug stayed the same, but the story changed. Addiction did not disappear, it migrated. From coastal dens to rural Europe, from colonial port cities to industrial America, from the poor to the middle class, from stigmatized communities to respectable households. And as addiction expanded across demographics the world once assumed were immune, moral judgment began to waver. Opium, once seen as a vice of weak nations, revealed itself to be indiscriminate. The contradiction deepened. Nations condemned the substance publicly while permitting corporate growth privately. The ethical vacuum of the colonial era had simply reshaped itself for a new audience. Political and economic outcomes. Nations built on quiet dependencies. By the mid-20th century, narcotics control became a geopolitical battleground. The U.S. launched aggressive anti-heroin campaigns while simultaneously supporting intelligence operations that relied on alliances with drug trafficking groups in Southeast Asia. During the Cold War, heroin networks in the Golden Triangle and Golden Crescent flourished partly because they supported anti-communist militias. Politics was no longer merely reacting to narcotics, it was using them. Meanwhile, international pharmaceutical giants produced synthetic opioids that supplied hospitals worldwide. These companies acquired influence over regulatory agencies, medical associations, and research institutions. Their financial power rivaled that of small nations. Opium, once a crop grown in contested fields, had become a pillar of global medicine and a pillar of global profit. Every country relied on opioids for pain relief. Every government faced pressure to regulate, without restricting medical care. Every health system struggled to balance compassion with caution. The conflict had evolved from imperial exploitation to institutional dependence. Not forced poppy fields, but hospital corridors. Not gunboats, but corporate boardrooms. Not colonial merchants, but multinational pharmaceutical executives. Families and communities. The human cost reborn. As modern opioids spread, addiction tore through communities with a familiar pattern. Quietly at first, then at a pace that exceeded the capacity of families to adapt. Mothers hid vials in bathroom cabinets. Fathers lied about prescriptions. Sons and daughters stole from savings accounts, pawned heirlooms, withdrew from school. Communities whispered but did not intervene, unsure whether addiction was illness, failure, or something in between. It was the old tragedy with new packaging. The opium machine no longer needed an empire. It operated inside homes. Doctors, trusted, respected, became unknowing gatekeepers. Pharmacies became distribution nodes. Marketing campaigns became the new propaganda machinery. And communities, overwhelmed and underprepared, endured the fallout. Addiction no longer carried the image of dimly lit dens. It wore the face of ordinary life. Suburban streets, rural towns, quiet apartments, emergency rooms. Opium had completed its evolution. From sacred ritual to commodity, from commodity to weapon, from weapon to system, from system to domestic crisis. And still, the machine was expanding. Science versus propaganda, the battle for truth. As the 20th century advanced, science stood at the crossroads between revelation and complicity. Researchers understood the neurological mechanics of opioids better than ever. How they hijacked endorphin pathways, reshaped reward circuits, rewired pain perception. Laboratories could trace addiction not to moral weakness, as old propaganda claimed, but to predictable, measurable biological processes. Yet this truth struggled against a century of inherited myths. Governments still framed addiction as a criminal failure. Corporations framed opioids as safe medical miracles. Communities, unsure whom to believe, oscillated between fear and denial. Where science urged nuance, propaganda insisted on simplicity. In some nations, addiction was portrayed as a foreign threat infiltrating pure society, echoing the same racialized narratives once used during the opium trade. In others, pharmaceutical companies funded research that conveniently underestimated addiction risks. Brochures assured doctors that new opioids were non-habit forming, echoing centuries-old patterns. Soften the message, expand the market. The clash between scientific reality and engineered narratives produced a cultural fog. A fog in which truth became negotiable and people became casualties of uncertainty. For individuals struggling with addiction, the consequences were catastrophic. Many hesitated to seek help, fearing stigma more than suffering. Families, influenced by propaganda, responded with shame instead of support. Policymakers, pressured by media panic, prioritized punishment over treatment. Science illuminated the path forward. Political agendas and corporate interests blocked it. The machine endured. Corporate takeover, the new architects of dependency. By the late 20th century, opioids were no longer solely derived from poppy fields. They flowed from laboratories, factories, marketing departments, and shareholder meetings. The opium machine had entered its most sophisticated phase, the corporate age. Pharmaceutical companies engineered new opioids with staggering potency. They crafted branding strategies that promised safety, relief, and modernity. They sponsored medical conferences, funded continuing education programs, and established relationships with regulatory agencies. Doctors were taught to treat pain aggressively. Patients were taught to demand relief. Regulators were taught to trust scientific authority, even when that authority was shaped by corporate influence. The result was predictable. Prescriptions soared, dependence soared, profits soared. And when addiction inevitably spiked, corporations redirected blame outward, onto patients, onto doctors, onto illegal drug suppliers, anyone but themselves. It was the imperial playbook, rewritten for the boardroom. Meanwhile, illegal markets adapted. Heroin distribution expanded into rural regions. Traffickers filled gaps left by prescription crackdowns. Synthetic opioids, cheap, potent, deadly, flooded streets with terrifying speed. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world faced a hybrid crisis. Legally manufactured addiction converging with illegal supply chains. Two industries, one licensed, one criminal, fed off the same demand. Opium had become a global business model. The global landscape, a crisis without borders. Every region now bore its own version of the opium legacy. In North America, prescription opioid epidemics triggered national emergencies. Rural communities were hit hardest, where economic decline fueled despair and pharmaceutical marketing targeted physicians with fewer resources. In Europe, heroin waves surged and receded in cycles. Influenced by Balkan route politics, shifts in Afghanistan's poppy cultivation, and evolving treatment policies. In Asia, production hubs moved like migrating storms. Afghanistan dominating cultivation, Myanmar's Golden Triangle supplying regional markets, while China and Southeast Asia battled synthetic opioid influxes. In the Middle East, conflict zones amplified the trade. Militias and insurgent groups used narcotics routes to finance operations, turning addiction into collateral damage of global warfare. In Africa, heroin trafficking expanded through coastal nations, creating new smuggling corridors and new consumer markets unprepared for the consequences. The world had turned into a mosaic of overlapping crises, each shaped by local politics, but connected through global demand. No region stood untouched, no society remained insulated. Opium, once a flower carried in ancient hands, had become a planetary force. The future crossroads, a choice that haunts every nation. As the 21st century deepened, governments faced a decision that echoed across history. Will they confront the roots of dependency, or merely treat its symptoms? Most chose the latter. Criminalization increased. Prisons overflowed. Treatment centers struggled. Prevention programs lacked funding. Corporate accountability remained elusive. Illegal markets thrived on punitive policies. The opium machine fed on failure. It adapted faster than regulations, expanded beyond borders, and infiltrated communities at their breaking points. And yet, beneath the machinery, movements began to rise. Scientists advocating evidence-based care, activists demanding reform, families refusing to accept shame as the price of survival. A quiet counterforce gathered momentum. Still, the crossroads remains unresolved. Will the world dismantle the structures that profit from pain? Or will it continue the cycle, modernized, repackaged, but unchanged at its core? The answer, uncertain and unfinished, leads us toward the final question of this documentary. What does humanity owe to those who suffered, those still suffering, and those yet to face the long shadow of the opium machine? The answer lies not in history alone, but in the moral landscape we choose next. History does not end. It echoes. And the story of opium, this wandering flower turned weapon, turned commodity, turned global system, echoes with a weight few other histories can carry. It presses on our present with the heaviness of unresolved responsibility. Because what began as a sacred plant in ancient fields has become a force that shaped nations, reconfigured economies, fractured families, and blurred the boundaries between healing and harm. The opium machine may have changed form, but its consequences remain stitched into the fabric of the modern world. And now, in this final chapter, we stand before a moral landscape, not to judge the past, but to understand the cost of forgetting it. The burden of memory. There is a quiet, unsettling truth at the heart of this history. Most of the suffering caused by opium was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was engineered by empires seeking leverage, by corporations seeking profit, by governments seeking control, by individuals seeking escape from worlds that offered them too little. And yet, when we speak of opium today, we often speak only of addiction, as if the personal struggle were the entire story, as if those who suffered do so in isolation, severed from the centuries of structures that made their vulnerability profitable. To remember the full history is to confront a difficult reality. Addiction did not begin with the addict. It began with the systems built around them. But memory alone is not enough. We must also examine the moral architecture that allowed this machine to expand for so long. Was it ignorance? Greed? Indifference? Or simply the human tendency to seek relief at any cost, matched by the human tendency to exploit that need? No answer is complete. All are true. The fragility of relief. A paradox runs through the entire narrative. Opium eased pain, even as it created more of it. Civilizations embraced it to soften suffering, to quiet fear, to bring calm to unbearable moments. Mothers used it to soothe infants. Soldiers used it to survive battlefield wounds. Workers used it to endure back-breaking labor. And for many, opium truly did offer comfort. Brief, fragile, and real. But relief has a shadow. And when societies become dependent on relief rather than reform, power shifts into dangerous hands. It is easier to medicate the symptoms than to transform the world that produces them. Easier to quiet the individual than to confront the system. Easier to sell escape than to address the reasons people seek it. This truth is not confined to history. It threads through modern life, through healthcare debates, economic inequality, mental health crises, political polarization. Opium is only one manifestation of a deeper pattern. When suffering becomes profitable, empathy becomes negotiable. Moral responsibility, a shared burden. So where does responsibility lie? With governments that permitted the trade, with corporations that engineered demand, with criminals who expanded supply, with physicians who overprescribed, with individuals who turned to the drug for comfort. The uncomfortable answer is that responsibility does not rest in a single place. It rests in the spaces between, in the systems, incentives, and pressures that shape human behavior. Opium's story reveals that morality is not simply a matter of individual choices, it is a matter of structures. When a society rewards harmful behavior, the harm becomes systematic. When it defines suffering as weakness, the vulnerable become targets. When it prioritizes profit over people, the machinery of exploitation grows without resistance. The challenge, then, is not to assign blame, but to understand the architecture of harm so deeply that we refuse to rebuild it. The weight of unanswered questions. We arrive at the closing stretch of this history with more questions than answers. Can a world built on cycles of dependency ever break free from them? Can governments regulate substances whose profits they quietly depend on? Can communities heal without addressing the conditions that drive people to numb themselves? Can science provide solutions when it has so often been shaped by the same forces it studies? And perhaps the hardest question of all, is humanity capable of learning from a wound this old, this vast, and this quietly enduring? These questions do not ask for immediate answers. They ask for courage. The courage to hold complexity without collapsing it into easy narratives. Because the truth of opium resists simplicity. It is neither purely a medicine nor purely a poison, neither purely a tragedy nor purely a warning. It is all of these at once. And that complexity is precisely what makes it a mirror, not of the past, but of us. The echo of accountability. To understand the full legacy of opium, one must confront a truth that sits quietly beneath all historical violence. Systems outlive their creators. The empires that weaponized opium have crumbled. The corporations that marketed early synthetic opioids have rebranded or dissolved. The governments that relied on opium taxation have fallen to coups revolutions, and the shifting tides of global power. But the consequences of their actions endure in forms they never anticipated. A family torn apart in rural America. A patient in a hospital bed shaking from withdrawal. A village in Afghanistan forced to choose between starvation and poppy fields. A community in Southeast Asia still carrying the social stigma of a trade they never controlled. A generation in China shaped by a national memory of humiliation so deep it still influences foreign policy. These stories are not epilogues. They are continuations of a chain reaction set in motion centuries ago, a chain that loops through the past and tightens around the present. Accountability, then, is not about judging yesterday with today's values. It is about recognizing that harm ripples forward in time, that suffering accumulates across generations, and that justice must reach backward even as it seeks to build forward. There is no punishment equal to the scale of what opium has wrought. But there may be a responsibility equal to it. To refuse to repeat the conditions that allowed it to flourish. The slow work of healing. Healing, as history shows, is never linear. Nations tried to ban opium. Communities fought to reduce stigma. Researchers sought safer treatments. Families rebuilt what was lost. Governments attempted regulation, rehabilitation, reform, yet every attempt encountered resistance. Sometimes from powerful lobbies, sometimes from political fear, sometimes from the simple truth that people in pain will always seek relief. Healing is slow, not because people resist change, but because the world offers more reasons for suffering than solutions to it. Still, there are moments, small, fragile, easily overlooked, that show what healing can look like. A recovering father holding his child again with steady hands. A rural clinic offering treatment instead of prison. A nation investing in mental health rather than punishment. A doctor listening without judgment. A policymaker choosing evidence over fear. A community breaking the silence that once protected stigma. These moments do not erase the past, but they prove that the machinery of harm is not the only machinery humanity can build. There can also be systems of care, of empathy, of accountability, of prevention, of resilience. The choice is not between perfection and failure. It is between indifference and effort. The final reflection. What this history asks of us. Standing at the end of this long corridor of history, we are left with a vision not of hopelessness, but of responsibility. The story of opium is the story of what happens when humanity treats suffering as a resource, something to be harvested, sold, leveraged, controlled. It shows what happens when relief becomes a commodity rather than a right, when pain becomes a marketplace, when weakness becomes opportunity. But it also reveals something deeper: the extraordinary human capacity to endure, resist, and rebuild. Families destroyed by addiction have rebuilt their foundations piece by fragile piece. Nations once fractured by exploitation have reclaimed their sovereignty with unyielding determination. Scientists once complicit in harm now lead movements for ethical medicine. Communities once shamed into silence now stand at the forefront of reform. This is not triumph, it is perseverance, quiet, difficult, ongoing. And perseverance is the soil from which moral clarity grows. What does this history demand from us? To question systems that benefit from pain. To defend those who stand at the edge of despair. To remember that every crisis has roots, and every root can be traced, understood, acknowledged. To refuse narratives that blame the vulnerable for wounds inflicted upon them. To build futures in which relief is humane and suffering is not harvested for profit. History cannot be rewritten, but its lessons can be. The unfinished ending. There is no clean closure to this documentary. No definitive moral victory. No single solution grand enough to dissolve centuries of entanglement. Instead, there is a final truth. Quiet, disquieting, necessary. The opium machine was built by human hands, and only human hands can dismantle its legacy. Whether we choose to do so remains the unanswered question of our age. The story does not end here. It waits in every policy debate, every prescription pad, every field of poppies, every family struggling in the dark, every nation remembering its wounds, every community deciding how to face suffering. The machine still hums beneath the surface of the modern world, but so does the possibility of change. And history, watching us from its long shadow, asks only one thing. What will we do with what we now know?